Hello class, and welcome to week 4 of Sound Bites. This week we'll be going over location-based genres and styles, which is sort of a transitionary period, but one that I think deserves robust attention so that we don't miss out on or erase different genres that are popping up during this time in our overarching concern for looking at rock and roll or rock music. So with that being said, let's begin. In the late 1950s, a number of events occurred that shook up the rock and roll music landscape. In 1957, Little Richard went on hiatus to join the Ministry for the first time. In 1958, Elvis Presley was drafted into the Army. In 1959, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and Buddy Holly, three rockers that we didn't get to cover last week, died in the same tragic plane crash. And in 1959, Chuck Berry was arrested for transporting a minor across state lines. Lastly, in 1959, the same year, the payola scandal unfolded that we covered last week, which resulted in Alan Freed, the one who coined and popularized the term rock and roll, being ousted from his position as a radio host in New York. These events created a vacuum on the national stage, where rock and roll music had previously been sweeping the nation. It seemed like the rock and roll movement was collapsing under its own weight and could not sustain itself into the future as a long-lasting genre of music. So, in a response, in the early 1960s, in this sort of vacuum that was created by the lack of rock and roll music, a number of regional genres and sounds formed. So to these years of the early 1960s, we can trace a number of different genres originating in this time, which would have their own influence and histories in years to come. I call these region or location-based genres not because other genres are not regional, most are, but because these genres really are tied to a specific culture in a specific place in a way that they don't necessarily broaden to being created nationwide. They're originating from a specific place within the nation. And the four regional genres that I want to give you a glimpse into this week are the sound of the Brill Building in New York City, surf rock from Southern California, especially Los Angeles. Here we see Dick Dale. Ska. Here we see the image of the Skatalites, and this is from Jamaica. And then Motown, which is based in Detroit, Michigan. The Brill Building was designed as a one-stop conveyor belt approach for songwriting and recording. It included services from songwriting, music production, recording, and music publishing services. So the way it would work is that an aspiring artist would show up at the Brill Building into the lobby, and they could say what part of the process they were at. Maybe they already had a song, maybe they needed a song written for them, maybe they already had a demo record that they wanted to pitch to a distributor. And then they would go to the appropriate place within their arc, within the building. Maybe there was a floor entirely dedicated to songwriters with numerous songwriters in cubicles pounding out new songs on the piano. And maybe they would go and get a new song. Maybe they would go to the recording floor where they would hire musicians there or have those musicians as part of a package to record their song for them while they sang. Or maybe if they already had their own record, they would go straight to the floor for publishing and distribution and just try to cut a deal with the business people that were on that floor. The Brill Building had it all, and the goal was to create a hit song factory in the style of a conveyor belt or assembly line. Now you can hear hallmarks of the Brill Building sound in the Spotify playlist through songs such as the Ronettes, the Shirelles, and Ben E. King. There was a heavy amount of sonic branding where you would know when you were listening to a Brill Building hit song, and they had heavy incorporation of strings and piano-led songs often. Generally speaking, Brill was known for girl group artists, that is, groups of female singers who together would form a name, such as the Ronettes or the Shirelles, but also had hits like Ben E. King's Stand By Me, so they produced male artists or male artist groups as well. Now, the Brill Building also produced some famous female songwriters, such as Carole King, Cynthia Weil, and Ellie Greenwich. Now, because of that, and in combination with the girl groups themselves, who are really reaching high visibility and popularity, this creates an interesting period of women's visibility in rock music history that later declines in sort of the rock music wave that follows with the British invasion, which focuses instead on male-led rock bands. And so I'd like to look at this period and how it's talked about as an interesting moment of gender representation within rock music history. And so I have a bit of a soapbox concerning this period of music within rock music history. Because sometimes rock fans or even rock scholars will talk about this period as if it's only a transition or an absence of rock music between the rock and roll artists of the 1950s and the coming of the Beatles with the British invasion. And so in that way, they would consider the sounds of Brill and other artists in this time in the early 1960s to be not rock music. But as we'll see time and time again later in the course, I'm suspicious of and want to problematize the notion that we can easily delineate what is rock music versus not rock music. And so often I think what we find is that when people are trying to categorize what is rock music and what is not rock music, a lot of times it's trying to draw the circles, draw the boundaries around certain demographic identity factors, such as gender. And so when people say, well, Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, rock and roll. Big Mama Thornton and Rosetta Tharpe, rhythm and blues, the Shirelles and the Supremes, girl groups. I think what we see there is a markedness of based on gender, trying to say, well, rock and roll music proper features a male singer's voice, and because of that, these other groups who, such as Big Mama Thornton or the Supremes, would not be considered under rock and roll. So you'll often hear people say, well, the Brill Building's sound is more pop to me. But I'm a little skeptical of this claim as well, because the term of pop often gets used as a marking factor to exclude certain music from women artists and women-led groups from the sort of hallowed halls of rock and roll. So overall, as we'll learn in this course, I'm really a big umbrella kind of person when it comes to defining rock music or rock and roll music, and I think that there's room under this big umbrella term also for the sounds of Brill and Motown and other artists and genres that we'll see this week. Now moving on, the Brill Building sound also introduced prominent Latin musical influences, particularly from the wave of Puerto Rican immigrants to New York City. And so the sounds that were surrounding these songwriters often ended up being incorporated or borrowing performers from these scenes to make the music in the Brill Building. Next we go from New York City to Southern California, and we look at surf rock. Now, surf rock sort of has two main manifestations, and I think talking about the split and difference between the two also points to similar divides within surf culture as well, or within what surfing meant to different subcultures in Southern California. So let's start with Dick Dale, who is called the king of the surf guitar, and he aimed to capture the feel of surfing itself. Usually his tone was very heavy, and he had a percussive electric guitar style that was drenched in wet reverb, and so metaphorically speaking, his music sounded very much like the feeling of crashing in the surf. Now, Dick Dale himself was influenced by Lebanese and Polish stringed instruments, and also from big band jazz drums, and so his influences were quite diverse that he sort of synthesized into this signature electric guitar sound. Dick Dale was known for making a number of innovations in electric guitar playing. He had a Stratocaster guitar that he called the Beast because he had very high gauge strings, that is very thick strings on his electric guitar. And this produced more heavy sound and more tension, especially on the low strings. It's also important to note that he played electric guitar left-handed, but instead of having a special instrument made for him, he took a right-handed guitar and flipped it upside down, so he just played it upside down. This tended to emphasize the bass tones with a heavier stroke, while the treble tones had sort of a softer, more round tone to them. Now, the guitar amplifier company Fender developed a custom 100-watt amp specifically for Dale because of his reputation of blowing up amp after amp. That is, if you turn up the gain from the electric guitar too high and it's more than the amplifier can take, you can destroy the amp. And so they created a special high-capacity amp for him to use. Now, Dick Dale's prominent song Meeserloo, which you can hear in the Spotify playlist, was famously sampled by the Black Eyed Peas. Definitely check this out in the playlist and you'll recognize the sample pretty much straight away. And he was also called the father of heavy metal for the way that he would really wail on the electric guitar and have a percussive and rhythmic emphasis style. So in comparison to someone like Chuck Berry, whose guitar licks were very classy and sophisticated, Dick Dale was more about just really ramming into and strumming heavily on the electric guitar. And so this was seen as having some resonances or influences upon the formation of heavy metal. So Dick Dale is one vision of what surf culture means or what it means to surf. And so now let's look at a very different take on what surfer subculture meant. And that would be the Beach Boys. So I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the Beach Boys, and they do originate from this period of the early 1960s. They presented a very different take on Southern California surf culture than Dick Dale. If you could put it this way, if Dick Dale was giving more of the sound of being in the water and wiping out, the Beach Boys were more like the sound of being on the beach and driving around Pacific Coast Highway in fancy cars. The Beach Boys perfected a formula for writing popular songs, which focused on themes of girls, cars, and surfing. Most of their songs used two or more of these themes in combination. The Beach Boys rose to fame in the early 1960s. However, they had a troubled career due to family abuse, particularly the Wilson brothers' father, and the songwriter Brian Wilson's own struggles with alcoholism and depression, resulting in a hiatus from touring. During this time, Brian Wilson's creativity was hard at work, resulting in the album Pet Sounds in 1966. This album, though received rather lukewarmly at first, has now been considered a highlight of artistry and audio production on par with the Beatles albums, such as Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, the Beach Boys' career, they reached their height from 1962 to 1966, and ultimately declined when other popular boy bands like the Beatles took the spotlight. However, they continued touring till the 1990s as a nostalgia group, and lived off of residual sales of their records from the time. Next, we're moving on to the genre of ska. Now, in textbooks and courses on the history of rock music, they tend to focus on the United States and the United Kingdom, the UK, but might overlook musical trends that are being generated in other countries, such as Jamaica. However, we need to understand these trends in their historical context to see how they influence other genres, including ones in the United States and the United Kingdom. So, ska was developed in Jamaica and should really be identified with Jamaica as a location. If you listen to the ska pieces in the Spotify playlist, such as by the Scatolites, you'll hear the presence of an electric guitar strum on the offbeats. So if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, one, and, all on the offbeats. And this sound would come to be the signature of ska and be described with the name ska. Now, ska originated in black Jamaican communities after slavery was outlawed in 1834. It drew on the cultural heritage and musical traditions of Africa that were preserved throughout being enslaved, and so enslaved peoples continued to preserve these traditions that eventually emerged to influence ska. And so after slavery was outlawed in 1834, these musical traditions experienced a revival, and were then later cross-pollinated with rock and roll music and jazz via the radio and via records that were brought by visitors. Now, the popularity of ska depends heavily on the existence of what are known as sound systems. Sound systems were mobile sets of speakers and turntables that were loaded up into automobiles, into cars, and that could bring music concerts portably to different neighborhoods around Jamaica. And so this was much easier than, for example, a lot of people coming to a centralized venue and hearing a rock concert there. Instead, the concert would go to the people. And so these sound systems really influenced the type of music that could be performed and the way that it would be presented. For example, the ska's emphasis on incorporating sort of like a jazz big band horn section was ideal for this kind of travel. You could set up multiple horn players in the back of a truck, along with the sound system for the electric guitar and other electric instruments, and you had a mobile concert that could be heard for miles. The most influential ska group during this time was the Scatolites. Bob Marley also makes an appearance, although he'll be developing further and appear later in the timeline to be associated more with reggae. Ska influenced the United Kingdom, specifically in the 1970s. There was a version of ska that became known as two-tone in the United Kingdom and would influence the emergence of punk rock in the 1970s. We'll get there later in the course. But for now, just put a pin in it and remember that ska music will become influential on British rock music in the 1970s. Last but certainly not least, we get to Motown, also known as Hitsville, USA. Now, Motown Records has a huge history as a label, and you probably have heard of their songs and records even if you don't know specifically about Motown. But it's appropriate to talk about them here in the early 1960s because Motown Records is founded in 1960 by Berry Gordy Jr. And so on our sort of whirlwind tour of different location-based styles, Motown is very much rooted in Detroit, Michigan, with the talent that can be found there, and specifically drawing from the black communities. So Motown Records was designed to be a one-stop shop, much like Brill. Berry Gordy defined his vision as a kid could walk in one door an unknown off the street and come out the other end a polished performer. So in addition to services that Brill offered, like songwriting or recording, production, and distribution, Motown also offered complete artist development services, programs that included dance and clothing, fashion, as well as polishing etiquette. The idea was to create a complete polished performer out of the artists that came through Motown's doors. Throughout the decades, Motown Records would become known as a prominent cultural voice within black communities. It was a black-owned business, featured primarily black musicians, and it defied the exclusivity that was produced by race music, or rebranded as rhythm and blues. This is because many Motown hits became mainstream chart toppers on the pop charts, whereas traditionally music by black artists had often been relegated to the race music or rhythm and blues charts instead. So in this way, Motown aimed to achieve a measure of sonic integration through creating irresistible hit songs. Berry Gordy just wanted to create a sound that would really enrapture people and just become so infectious and irresistible that regardless of the racialized factors during the 1960s, it would become a sound that people of all racial backgrounds would want to listen to. It would take a teaching video in and of itself to list the countless hit artists who came through the doors of Motown Records, what Berry Gordy referred to as his Motown family. For example, the Jackson 5, Lionel Richie, and Stevie Wonder all found their starts in Motown. However, just to focus on the acts that were around in the early 1960s, we have the Supremes. This was Motown's leading girl group as a response to and rivaling anything from the Brill Building, and they were renowned for their fashion style and their choreography, as well as the musical synergy of their voices. Diana Ross in particular becomes a headliner that really takes on a solo career above and beyond the Supremes, but they originate as a group in this era of the early 1960s. Next we have the Temptations, which is a group of male singers. Now this was also Motown's answer to girl groups such as put out by Brill, in that it was taking the idea of a group of women singers that had a lot of appeal and transferring that onto a group of male singers that had a similar appeal. So like the Supremes, they were known for their choreography and their showmanship, even having a dance move named after them, the Temptation Walk, and scoring multiple top 10 hits on the mainstream charts. Now, you might have heard of the Temptations song My Girl, which is in the Spotify playlist, and I also have included a recording of a fun joint concert by the Supremes and the Temptations, where they mostly sing each other's repertoire. And so it's just a really fun way of illustrating the sort of showmanship that these groups had. And lastly, I have to make mention of Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. So Marvin Gaye was originally a drummer at Motown, but transitioned into being a vocalist and even writing and producing his own records eventually as he matured. Now, he was famous for his collaboration with Tammy Terrell, who sadly and tragically passed away in 1969. This was an event that would impact Marvin Gaye's perspective as an artist and sort of figuring out how to pick up the pieces of his career after Tammy Terrell's death. So in Marvin Gaye's solo career, he had albums such as What's Going On that were extremely influential, and we will cover What's Going On later in the course. Alright, so that gives you an overview to understand this week's materials. Now just remember the big takeaway is we have these regional or location-based genres, from the Brill Building's sound to surf rock in Southern California, ska in Jamaica, and Motown in Detroit. And each of these in its own way took and developed the sounds from rock and roll that influenced them, and then would create records and sounds that would go on to influence later rock music as well. Alright, that's going to do it for this teaching video, so bye-bye for now.